Let's get started. I'm Ethan Jewett. At Mindset, I'm Senior Director of DevOps Development and Technology. Do a bunch of work on BTP with my team. We've got Matthew Wigham here as well, who's leader of our BTP Center of Excellence. And so if questions come up during the course of this presentation, discussion, however you all want to do it, then you've got both of us. And I know there's a bunch of knowledge in the room as well. I'll be talking today about BTP architecture and best practices. And probably talk for about 30, 35 minutes, and there'll be plenty of time for questions. But if there are any questions as we're going along, please just jump right in. I'm happy to answer things as they come up. I won't have all the answers, but I'm sure we can figure it out together. So in terms of our agenda and what we're going to be covering today, most of what I want to talk about is sort of, if you're getting into BTP and getting started, what do you want to be thinking about at the beginning? And then once you've got BTP, you've decided to move ahead with it, and you've got it in place, what types of things do you want to be thinking about when you're developing applications or services within BTP? So kind of breaking it up into those two different sections, getting set up and then building with BTP. And then at the end, if we have time or if it is relevant to some questions that you all have, just a few patterns and examples that I'd like to run through that I think are relevant to what a lot of people are going through with BTP right now. So let's get started. Any questions to start out with, or dive right in? All right. So let's start by talking about BTP strategy. When you're getting started with BTP, what are a couple of the key things you want to be thinking about as you get going? I really like to kind of use these presentations to get you thinking, generate ideas. It's not going to be all the answers, but some key things that you should be thinking about, and then you can kind of take it from there. So in terms of strategy, one of the first questions people ask about BTP, and the most confusing things coming in, is the commercial model. This is the case with hyperscalers as well, but there aren't as many different commercial models with a lot of hyperscalers. With BTP, there are kind of three big divisions of commercial model. There's the consumption type of model and the subscription model. And then within the consumption model, there is an enterprise agreement style of model, and there's a pay-as-you-go style of model. So briefly, just taking it from the top, what that means is if you have a consumption model, that means you're paying for every piece of the platform that you're using, usually on an hourly or monthly basis, okay? But you choose what you're using. You can use any part of the platform, and there are no restrictions on what you can use, really. You can impose restrictions. We'll talk about that a little bit. But from SAP's side, there are no restrictions on what you can use. But if you use it, you pay for it, right? If you go with an enterprise agreement, you're just prepaying, usually at a lower rate. But you're still going to pay for everything you use for. And if you go past what you've agreed to in your enterprise agreement, you're going to pay for that on a pay-as-you-go basis. If you go with the pay-as-you-go model, you're just paying for what you use. At the list price, SAP publishes the pricing for the different services, and that's going to be how it works. So that's pretty simple. That's how it works with AWS, with Azure, with GCP. There's a second option, or a third option, the subscription model. And this model is where you pay up front for access to a specific service at a specific level. That's all you have access to, and you don't have the option to go out and try another service or use another service as part of that account normally, unless you also have a pay-as-you-go model in place. So you need to make a choice between those three different models. And SAP is usually now gonna point you towards, and I think rightly so, the consumption model. That's the flexible model. It's the cloudy model. It's the model where you don't have to engage in a new contract and a discussion with your sales representative every time you want to change the way you use BTP or use something new within BTP. So highly recommended, go with the consumption model. And within the consumption model, as you're getting started, if you're new to this, you want to use the pay-as-you-go model because you don't really know how much you're going to use necessarily. You maybe don't want to start with an enterprise agreement right out the gate, but if you know how much you're using, or you've been using BTP for a little while and you have a good idea of what the services you're going to use are going to cost, go with the enterprise agreement. You can oftentimes get a fair amount of savings. But some warnings. and these are some of the key things that you need to be paying attention to as you're using BTP. You need to engage, if you're using the consumption model, you need to engage in quota management, okay? You've got to be very careful, just like you are with AWS or with Azure or with GCP. You need to be very careful about putting quotas in place to control how much you're using. You can make mistakes, and you can use too much, and so you need to be carefully monitoring that and putting quotas in place. With BTP, it is a little bit different from most of the hyperscalers because sometimes the tools aren't there to put good enough quota management in place using technical barriers, okay? So it's very important to always be monitoring your BTP usage as well. So keeping a close eye on that, either using technical tools that you set up or just by checking on a regular basis and having that be part of your normal cadence. So that's going to be very important. Also, a couple of gotchas. So one thing to be aware of is that if you're in a consumption model, you have some quotas put in place by SAP. Some of them you can see in your management launchpad in the cockpit. Some of them you cannot. So there is a quota in place on your account for Cloud Foundry memory usage, for example, that you cannot see on your account. So if you create enough Cloud Foundry applications, eventually you're going to run into that quota and your deploys are going to start failing and you're not going to know why. So you need to go read the SAP notes that explain the quotas and you need to keep an eye on that. So currently the Cloud Foundry runtime quota is 50 gigabytes of memory, which is probably pretty good for most people. Who was it? Somebody said once that no one is ever going to need more than 512 kilobytes of memory or something like that. So just remember that quota is in place. That a lot of people have run into that. Sometimes SAP fiddles with the quota, and they will let you know. But if you don't know that the quota is there, you might not be aware of it and might not be watching for that, and your deploys might start failing, which can be very disruptive to your operations. So yeah, the subscription model, we actually kind of push people away from that, and for good reason. There are services that are not compatible with the subscription model at all. And as I said earlier, making changes to your usage patterns requires a whole contract discussion. So it's not very agile. It's not very flexible or cloudy. That said, it does work better for some companies. There are some use cases where it makes sense. And you can theoretically run both models in parallel within the same global account. So if it does start to make sense for certain applications, there are options to do that, but you'll have to talk with SAP about that. So that's commercial models. Any questions about commercial models? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about multi-cloud strategy. I think this is something really important to think about. Most companies are going to fall into one of two categories when it comes to multi-cloud. There are going to be companies where things are very simple. Companies where you're just an SAP shop. You don't really use a hyperscaler for application build right now. Maybe you host your SAP systems on AWS or something like that, but you're not using AWS services for building apps. You build your apps on SAP. So for these types of companies, it oftentimes makes sense to just go with BTP as your cloud service provider. If you don't want to put the investment into learning a hyperscaler, AWS, Azure, GCP, and you want to go with whatever SAP is recommending and stay on the rails, then BTP makes a lot of sense in those circumstances. I'm guessing we don't have a lot of those companies here. Anyone who's just like right in that lane? Or are we more the type 2? Type 2 is where you have an enterprise hyperscaler strategy. As an enterprise, you use AWS or Azure or GCP. You probably run Active Directory on Azure. You probably run SharePoint, Office applications. You probably run a bunch of infrastructure on AWS. And because of this, you have an enterprise strategy, and SAP is a part of that strategy, but SAP doesn't dictate the enterprise strategy, right? I'm guessing that's where most companies are here. So you have heterogeneous investments in IT landscape, right? You're not going to go with one cloud. You're not going to go with just BTP. And for you, you need to figure out where does BTP make sense, if it does make sense at all for what we're building and what we're trying to do, versus another hyperscaler or on-premise or in our own data center type of deployments. So almost everybody here is in type 2. There are a lot of companies that are type 1 that are usually smaller, but I think for the purposes of our discussion, we're going to focus quite a bit on this sort of multi-cloud option. And we'll get to some of these patterns and things like that later that can help with that. So for type 2, BTP is a good option in some cases, and I think we can talk about some of those. But you always have to do the cost-benefit analysis, right? There are going to be a lot of pieces of BTP that are going to be competitive with hyperscaler offerings. So if you're looking at using BTP's Kyma runtime, which is a Kubernetes runtime in BTP, or the Cloud Foundry runtime, which is, as it says, a Cloud Foundry runtime, you're going to be comparing that to something like AWS's Elastic Kubernetes service for Kyma, or to GCP or Azure's equivalent, right? And you're going to need to do the cost-benefit analysis there. And to be honest, I think oftentimes the hyperscalers are going to win in those types of comparisons, right? There are going to be other situations, like if I need a Fiori launchpad or a Fiori-style portal, where it would be extremely expensive for me to try to rebuild a Fiori launchpad experience on AWS. So the easy thing to do and the cost-effective thing to do is going to be to use SAP's Build Work Zone service within BTP. I may hook that up to services and applications that I have on AWS or that I've built in Azure in Power Apps or something like that. But if I want users to have that Fiori user experience, then I'll use the BTP service because that's just what makes sense. And we have to do that cost-benefit analysis for almost all of these services. Other services that are very interesting from a BTP perspective are the integration suite, especially with a lot of the delivered content from SAP. So if we use SAP solutions like SuccessFactors or Concur or S/4HANA Cloud, integration suite offers a lot of pre-delivered content that will help us to integrate those much more easily. And we would have to rebuild that content on another integration platform. So maybe it makes sense to use integration suite. Yes? Yeah. So the question was, if you already have middleware that where you've integrated these applications, how do we decide if we're going to go with BTP versus that? And I think it's a very one-off question. It really depends on your middleware and the specific use case you have in mind. Another probably not what you're thinking of, but a lot of companies who are running SAP have PIPO, and they're using that as their middleware, right? And so if you want to move to the cloud, the migration path there from PIPO to integration suite may be much smoother than moving to MuleSoft or AWS integration services. So, but it's really going to depend on what your specific landscape looks like right now. You may just want to stay with PIPO and go with, as Sam was talking about, kind of like the new versus adapt versus enable. Like, you may just say, everything new, we're going with this new offering. And that new offering, for you, it might make sense to use integration suite, or it might make sense to use something else. In the integration space, there are a ton of options out there. So oftentimes, you're going to end up in a heterogeneous place as well. So you may want to develop a small competency in some of the BTP services for when it makes sense, especially for that SAP to SAP integration. And a larger competency for your enterprise integration approach. Okay, does this make sense? Anyway, just to get you thinking about this stuff. Can't give. As you can kind of see here, there aren't going to be any hard and fast answers for most of these services. I think for some of them, there are going to be some clear answers. The Launchpad especially is a clear win, but for a lot of them, it's a very murky area still. So you're going to need to develop that ability to make that comparison. All right. Any other questions on multi-cloud strategy? That's kind of the intro. We'll get to some multi-cloud discussions a little bit later on, but if we have time anyway. But let's talk about account design. So the other big piece of, looks like we've died. The other big piece of getting started with BTP is going to be figuring out what your account design looks like. And SAP, oops, the PowerPoint conversion has made some of my slides that have links in them look a little bit weird. SAP provides some really, that says good documentation and guidance on account models. And so I would really recommend looking at that documentation, perusing it, fully understanding it. There are some weaknesses in it, and we'll talk about a couple of those, but there is a lot of good documentation around how to set up your account model. Number one is you want to try to have a single global account. There are some reasons why you would want to have multiples, but a lot of people end up in a situation where they have multiple global accounts for no particularly good reason. It's just that somebody bought SAP Analytics Cloud over here in the organization from their SAP account executive, and somebody bought a BTP subscription over here in another part of the organization, and you ended up with two global accounts. Try not to do that. Try to consolidate on a single global account. But then within that global account, BTP provides a bunch of different options for managing your global account. Starting with sub-accounts. The main option for managing your global account is sub-accounts. You're going to have a lot of sub-accounts. A sub-account is just a container where you put a bunch of services and users and authorizations, and you maintain those within the sub-account. So you can think of it as a landscape instance of a system for those of us who come from the SAP world. I have a dev system, a QA system, and a prod system. Each of those systems have their own set of users, have their own set of configuration and settings. If I go to SM59, I've got my own set of destinations to other systems. Same concept for a sub-account, right? It's got a set of destinations, it's got a set of services, it's got a set of users. And the question is, how do we arrange our sub-accounts? How do we set them up? And SAP provides a bunch of different options there. You want to create different sub-accounts for lots of different reasons. Pretty much all of the same reasons that we create different SAP systems in our existing landscapes. We do it for staging, so like I said, dev, QA, and prod. We do it to separate different teams and different work and different functional areas and regions. We do it to have access restrictions. So I'm sure some of us are in companies where there are parts of the business that are working in a more restrictive regulatory or security landscape than other parts of the business, and sometimes that means we'll have a separate SAP system. In this case, we would oftentimes need a separate sub-account for those parts of the business. And we do it also, and this is a little bit different than the normal SAP world, we do it also to provide access to shared resources. So if I want to have a single HANA Cloud Service instance, for example, I might put that in one sub-account and then share that with some of the other sub-accounts that I have. That's a pattern that we will see fairly often. What are some of the drawbacks of multiple sub-accounts, like why we would want to reduce proliferation of these multiple sub-accounts? There are two big ones, which are duplicate configuration and duplicate administration. If you have two different sub-accounts, you've got to configure all the same destinations that you need in each of those sub-accounts. You've got to configure all the same users in each of those sub-accounts. This can be helped greatly by implementing IAS, the sort of shared account services. So we highly recommend doing that. But there's still a certain amount of duplication that you have to engage in. The question is, though, how do you decide which type of model to use? So there are several different models that SAP provides for sub-accounts. And then there's a concept of directories that SAP also has that you should also consider using if you're going to have any kind of complexity to your BTP instance. SAP provides a matrix, a decision matrix within that documentation I was talking about that helps you decide on different sub-accounts. Mostly focused on what do things look like if I need it for staging, what do things look like if I need it to split functional areas and regions, and what do things look like if I need to use sub-accounts to enable a CI/CD type of approach. Meaning in that scenario that I have many dev sub-accounts. I basically give my dev teams full control over their own individual sub-account. And then I have a CI/CD process that merges all that development into a single QA sub-account and a single production sub-account. What SAP kind of skips over in its decision matrix that you should think about very carefully is that you're going to need multiples of those different types of sub-account approaches. You're going to need staging. You're also going to need regional or functional differentiation in your sub-accounts. And once you become mature, you're also going to need CI/CD. So you're going to end up with a sub-account approach where SAP talks about sub-account arrangement 3, 4, 5, and 6, and you're going to have a combination of all of those, and you're going to need to think about how to do that. The best way to think about doing that is to use directories, okay? So you'll use directories to deal with some of the higher level splits between your different accounts. A directory is just a folder that you put a bunch of sub-accounts in. Sub-accounts and directories. You can have multiple levels of directory hierarchies. But what directories allow you to do is maintain the set of users, maintain the set of authorizations, and maintain the set of quotas and entitlements for that whole mess of sub-accounts that are under the directory. So you don't have to do it for every single one of them. So that's what you'll want to use directories for. And you'll want to very carefully think through those different sub-account concepts that SAP provides and work out how you're going to combine them in each case. So we can talk about some examples if you want to get into that, but that's what you should be thinking about. So this is a little bit of a rehash. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. I feel like Sam. But the sort of different reasons you would split sub-accounts and the different reasons you would use directories according to SAP. At least in my mind, I think there are a lot more reasons to use directories than just these, than just functional area location and subsidiaries. It may very well make sense to have a staging directory. So a directory that is just for your development systems. If I'm going to have sub-accounts per development team, then I probably want to have a directory that has an overall development quota associated with it so that I can manage that at the top level instead of trying to manage it at each different sub-account level. So there's going to be more to it than just what SAP provides. But if you see somebody talk about sub-account approach 3, sub-account 4, sub-account 5, this is what they're talking about. So if they say sub-account grouping 5, they're talking about grouping by functional areas. All right. So that's the strategy part, the sort of like, what do I do before I get started, the things you should think about. Let's jump into what do we do when we're developing applications and services on BTP. And there are a couple different aspects of this I want to talk about. The first one I want to talk about is how do we structure our intake and development and architecture for BTP applications. So whether I'm building a new SAP, what's it called now? SAP Build Workzone Standard Edition. That's the new name for the Launchpad service, Fiori Launchpad, or SAP Build Workzone Enterprise Edition, or if I'm building a Cloud Foundry application or a microservice running on Kaima, or an integration suite, iFlow. How do I get structured in a way that works for intake and then for managing my development and architecting that development? I'm going to share for you a little bit of the way that we think about it at Mindset and the way that we see a lot of our customers thinking about it. The first is that you need to have a project governance model. So I think most companies have this in some respect, and a lot of companies are following SAP's guidance. SAP provides a project onboarding document suggestion as part of their BTP documentation, and it's pretty much like right in line with most sort of enterprise project onboarding documents. It's like, what is the name of this project? Where is it going to be stored? Like, where's the Git repository? What's the security that's going into this? What business units does it focus on? That kind of stuff. That's all really important. There are a few other things that I think are also really important when you're starting a new project on BTP. We're trying to be agile. We're trying to be cloud focused. We're trying to have a sort of cloud mindset for doing our development work, and we need to take that modern approach. So 3 other things that I think are super important for intake for projects. First of all, there should be some type of design process underway or complete in order to get started with a project, especially if it's going to be user-facing. But even if it's not going to be user-facing, design is still really important. It just might not be UX design, right? It might be process design or industrial design or industrial process design. There could be lots of options, but there should be some design component to what you're trying to do. A lot of the applications we build are UX applications, so it's almost always a UX design component that's associated with that. But as we kind of heard about a little bit today, design thinking is not just for user experience. There should be what we call a minimum viable architecture. This is what SAP also talks about as minimum viable architecture. It's part of SAP's lean architecture framework, and which is basically just sort of like TOGAF slimmed down really far. Minimum viable architecture just means that we've met our corporate standards for how we're going to define what we're building here from an architecture thinking perspective, which means we have a good concept of what this solution is, oftentimes a solution concept diagram. We have a good concept of what's currently in place, so a baseline solution architecture, and we have a good concept of what we're going to do to realize this thing. Not at the very, very, very detailed level, but just at the technical building block level, a solution realization diagram. So at Mindset, that's what we think of as sort of the very, very basic minimum viable architecture, and we'd be looking for that for most project intake. At each of our customers, there's a different level of project intake requirements, but I would encourage you all to think about having that sort of minimum viable architecture concept in some form. And then lastly, if we're going to be doing an agile implementation, there's got to be a product backlog that is defined at some level. Okay? So some places want to go into a project with a backlog that's fully defined. Some organizations want to go into a project with a partially defined backlog, and then they define the backlog as part of the project. Either way works. Getting it fully defined is a little bit safer. The other thing that SAP and its BTP governance guidelines doesn't cover is that it's not just at the beginning of the project, right? You've got to check this stuff every step along the way. And so you have to come back and check this regularly. If you're running an agile scrum process, doing it at the sprint level makes a lot of sense to just check every sprint that your governance, your architecture has been updated, that your design is in line with the application, all that stuff. Just conceptually, is everybody familiar with this type of slide? The app house, like design thinking, architecture thinking interplay. So design's heavier at the front, but stays on for the entire project. Architecture is lighter at the front, but as you start to get into implementation and delivery and that project onboarding, architecture becomes much more important as you go through. So as you're going through a design thinking process, the same thing is true. Up front at the beginning, that sort of enterprise architecture, technical architecture needs to be in the room, but isn't extremely important in directing the decision making. We're much more in problem finding mode at that point in time. But as soon as we're into solution mode, architecture starts to become much more important. And at some point, we need to have that stage gate of saying we need to have that minimum viable architecture defined. The point of doing that, the value of doing that is really that it aligns. That's, at least in my mind, that's the role of architecture, is aligning all of these different teams, all of these different stakeholders, from developers to infrastructure to networking to end users to product owners, around what we're going to be trying to accomplish. And enterprise architecture, it's not just about technology, it's also about the functional process and the business value that we're trying to get out of this. So it's about communication and alignment. And the minimum viable architecture is just making sure that there is a cohesive and aligned vision of what we're trying to accomplish at each of those levels, at the enterprise architecture level, the solution architecture level, and the technical architecture level. So that when I ask a developer what we're doing, their answer is a technical answer, it's a development answer, but it's aligned with the answer that I'll get when I ask one of the business stakeholders what we're going to get out of this, what we're doing this project for. All right? One other, I think, important topic for BTP when you're thinking about BTP, and this is this is just BTP focused here, but you need to compare these to your hyperscaler options as well, is that there are a bunch of different development and deployment models just within BTP. And most of these have analogs to hyperscalers also. So if I'm looking at AWS, there will also be development and deployment models. This is where things get a little bit hairy from a technical perspective, and you start to need to make some specific decisions. And I don't really think that there's a right decision among most of these options. But some of the options you should have in mind, SAP provides a bunch of different application models that you can use. There's the cloud application programming model, which is the model that SAP will recommend that you use for building non-ABAP applications in BTP or on HANA XSA for that matter. There's a Java version and a Node version of it if you want to make it even more complicated. So either of those is an option. Then SAP provides the RESTful application programming model, which I think probably many of us are more familiar with if we have an SAP background. This is the programming model to use when we're building applications on the ABAP side of the stack. So I think that a lot of the time we're thinking that we're either choosing ABAP or non-ABAP to start out with, and then that dictates the programming model. I don't really like that way of doing it, but sometimes you do find yourself in that mindset where I need to build this on the ABAP stack. The most common occurrence of that is I've got a business process that's running in SAP, and I need to build a set of APIs for it because SAP doesn't provide the APIs in the latest version of S/4HANA, which is very common, or because I'm on an older version or I'm on Business Suite and I need to provide APIs for my SAP system out into the cloud. So that's the most common scenario where we're going to be building an application using ABAP wrap or a predecessor. Other than that, you probably would err towards using non-ABAP approaches, but it really depends a lot on your skill set internally at your company. So if you got a lot of ABAP developers and no JavaScript, Node, Java developers, then ABAP might be the way to go. Another option with SAP and with all of the hyperscalers is serverless, okay? So CAPM is a model where it's, at best, microservices, but oftentimes sort of slightly more monolithic applications. Serverless means the ultimate breakdown of my application into oftentimes not even microservices, okay? So there's no server that's running all the time for my application. I'm writing a bunch of cloud functions and queuing and consumption of those queues, and that's how I build my applications. You can do this in BTP in the Kyma runtime to a large extent, and you need to compare that with the serverless approach to building applications on the hyperscalers. The other thing to keep in mind is you don't have to use SAP's programming models, okay? You can deploy any kind of application on Cloud Foundry or on Kyma. Kyma is just a Kubernetes runtime. So you can build an application in Kubernetes, you can deploy it there. So if the CAPM model is not for you, that doesn't mean that you can't deploy your applications in Kyma. Maybe you have a corporate function of building microservices applications on Node.js using Express and like MongoDB or something like that. Sure. If you want, and you want to deploy those in BTP, you can deploy them on Kyma. SAP also provides a bunch of reference architectures. Obviously, we don't have time to go through them today, but take a look at them. There are reference architectures for building multi-tenant applications in BTP, which is a really, really useful reference architecture. It's not particularly BTP specific, so if you're interested in building multi-tenant applications, you can use that architecture in a hyperscaler as well. And they've got reference architectures for integrating hyperscalers and BTP. All right. Last topic I want to talk about really quickly is DevOps maturity. We talked about a lot of options for arranging things, for setting up accounts, for governing project intake and project execution. How do we make this work from a development perspective? How do we not get all bogged down like we oftentimes are in our SAP world with it taking a really long time to get changes into production? The answer is usually some version of a DevOps approach. And I want to just be really clear about what that is. I'm not going to get into this in a lot of detail, but if you want to talk about it more, ask questions or come talk to me. In my mind, DevOps is a cultural concept that we have to drive into our development and SAP and basis organizations. It's focused on improving 6 areas: collaboration and communication, which kind of go hand in hand; automation and tooling, which are sort of the technical piece and go hand in hand; and resiliency and transparency of our applications. I just want to make a quick note about resiliency and what that means, because in the SAP world, a lot of the time, what we're looking at doing is reducing what we call, within the DevOps world, you would call mean time to failure. We're very, very conservative about making sure that our systems never fail, because when a system fails, oftentimes it's a disaster, right? So we put a lot of effort into high availability, disaster recovery. We put a lot of checks in place for production changes so that it's very difficult to deploy to production. And we're very oftentimes, rightly, afraid of causing some kind of failure in our systems. The DevOps world has a completely different mindset, okay? And it's not entirely incompatible, but it's completely different. And it's focused on reducing mean time to recovery, okay? So the DevOps mindset takes the approach that failure is going to happen. How are we going to make it have the least impact possible? And the reason for this approach is because if we take this approach and we make it so that failure has very, very low impact, it reduces the risk of everything that we do. It allows us to move faster. It allows us to push down responsibility into development teams. And it allows us to get much faster measurements of mean time to change, which is kind of the #1 DevOps KPI. Is I have a problem come in or a new solution idea come in. How long does it take for that fix or that new solution to get into production and start realizing business value? Does it take a week or does it take 6 months? If it takes 6 months and there's another way of doing this that takes a week, I just lost out on 6 months of business value, right? How does that 6 months of business value that I lost out on compare to the cost of a possible failure in my system? That's a comparison you're each going to have to make within your own organization, right? But I think we can all agree that failure can be expensive, but lost business value can also be very, very expensive. And so if we can make the cost of failure much lower using DevOps approaches, then we might be able to move into a paradigm where we can actually see business value much more quickly. So anyway, DevOps is a culture. We build that culture through technology, process, and practice, which are in the opposite order of importance. Technology is the least important aspect of DevOps. Process is the second most important aspect of DevOps, having a clear process for how we do development, how we do operations. And practice, I think, is the most important, where we're teaching our teams and our developers to engage in development practices that are more effective at each of the 6 of those pillars of DevOps, which is something that I think in the SAP world we need to work on a lot. So DevOps, I think, is the key to making it so that all of this governance and approach that we've just talked about doesn't make life difficult for your developers and doesn't delay your time to value. So I think that's where we need to be focusing in terms of the other side of the coin of some of the governance and approaches that we just talked about. So if we put a new governance approach in place, or a new architecture approach in place, or a new development approach in place, or deployment approach in place, we need to create the tools, the technology tools, the process tools, and the practice tools so that it doesn't negatively impact our development teams and our ability to deliver value for our customers. Nobody likes it when everybody gets bogged down in all of this governance and end users can't get value, developers are frustrated, program managers are pulling their hair out trying to organize everybody. So when we put these guidelines, these rails in place, we need to back that up with technology, process, and practice. So that's most of what I wanted to talk about with BTP. We've got some patterns and examples, but we are more or less at time. We're going to try to get back on track. Were there any questions about all of this that anybody wanted to ask? Yeah.
Another question, like of all the BTP capabilities, what are the things that you think are the highest, have the highest value?
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah.
So the question was, of all the BTP capabilities, what are the things that you think, and I'm going to hand this off to Matthew, have the highest value?
Yeah, so some things that we've noticed, that especially what we've heard from customers, the most important, and Ethan touched on it, is SAP Build Workzone. They have an advanced edition of Build Workzone that enables you to basically create a portal and connect it to anything you ever want to connect it to. It's very, very flexible, very agnostic on however you're going to use it or use the data that you're going to bring into it. It's very, very capable. To recreate that on a hyperscaler outside of BTP is incredibly complex, very expensive. You're going to be paying a lot of people a lot of money to try to rebuild that, whereas with SAP you can pay a fixed price based on the number of users that you're going to assign to that work zone, and it's going to be running out of the box. Another area that is pretty valuable that we've seen are some of the newer data functions within BTP, especially around DataSphere. The new DataSphere, what's replacing Data Warehouse Cloud, kind of the other side of BW on HANA, right? And the new SAC's been around for a while, but the new kind of implementations and integrations are adding into SAC and how it sits on top of DataSphere. Some of those pre-packaged tenants are very, very valuable for organizations that we've seen, especially from the market. So
yep.
Those are, we focus on 5 areas of BTP here at Mindset, but those are especially 2 areas. Those are our top 2 areas that we focus on within Mindset. So we have a lot of capability and knowledge of those areas.
The other area I would kind of point you towards a little bit is the question of clean core, and we don't have a lot of time to get into what that means exactly, but SAP is really pushing us as customers, and I think it really helps us with agility and ability to upgrade and ability to keep our SAP systems current, to really focus on that clean core concept, which means no core mods, getting most enhancements out of our SAP systems if we can. And you can definitely do that without using BTP, okay? You can do clean core without using BTP, but it is easier if you use BTP.
Yeah.
SAP provides a lot of tools to help with that with BTP, and so the tools that are around that, like the like event mesh and just the destination and connectivity service, and tools like programming models like CAPM are really easy ways to get, as well as the BTP ABAP environment, are really easy ways to pull modifications out of your S4 system and keep your core clean, without doing a lot of investment in some of the infrastructure that would be required to do that on a hyperscaler. So that's something to think of too. Two architectures here for clean core. One on the left is BTP's architecture. They're at a pretty similar level of detail. And the one on the right is kind of what you would need to set up for a hyperscaler type approach. The bottom part is sort of, this is what you do if you don't have S4HANA and don't have business events. But the rest of it is something you would have to do anyway for a hyperscaler.
Yeah, and if you can fully pull off and be successful with clean core, your future S4 upgrades are going to be very smooth because you're getting a lot of those extensions out of your S4 system. You're keeping that core clean, so your future use is going to be a lot smoother and cheaper.
Great. Yeah, last question.
Do you provide the slide decks?
Will we provide the slide decks? I think we'll provide the slide decks, yes. If we don't, just email me. Thank you all for coming. I think we're going to adjourn and get everybody back on track here in terms of timing, so you got 5 minutes before the next session. If you've got questions, feel free to find me outside, and happy to talk about things.
Thank you very much.